Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of videos to help you improve your chess game. Today we're going to look at the question, the famous question, there have been movies about this, did Deep Blue cheat in the second game of the second match against Garry Kasparov? And I worked at both matches, so I have a good insight into what happened. So let's give you some background before we look at the game. In 1996, the ACM, Association of Computing Manufacturing, was celebrating its 50th anniversary of the creation of ENIAC at the University of Pennsylvania. So they wanted to have a celebration with some centerpiece, and they decided to invite the program, which had originally been Deep Thought at Carnegie Mellon and then went to IBM as Deep Blue, to play against world champion Garry Kasparov in Philadelphia. So the match was set up as a 6-game match in Philadelphia, and the ACM doesn't know anything about chess, so they asked the International Computer Chess Association, which is now known as the International Computer Game Association, to run the event for them, at least run the chess part of the event for them. So I was the only, as far as I know, I was the only ICCA member at that time who lived in Philadelphia. So as a chess master and someone who had a master's in software engineering, I was kind of an expert on both sides of the field. So I volunteered to be the person who would explain to the people who were there what was going on in the game, both from the master chess side and from the computer side. So I was going to be the lead speaker for each of the games. As the event grew nearer, it became bigger and bigger in how much publicity it was gathering. And one day I got a call from the guy who was organizing it, and I won't mention his name, but you could look it up. And he said to me, Dan, this has become really much bigger than we thought it was going to be, and I'm going to replace you as the lead moderator, and we're going to bring in Grandmaster Sirwan and Grandmaster Ashley to do this. So I was in no position to say anything but yes, sir. So unfortunately, I lost my job as being the lead moderator. And I did get a chance one time when Maurice was stuck. His train was late and coming from New York to get on the stage and at least say a few words. But I was replaced, and instead I became the lead scorekeeper. I was the one who would record the official match and release it to the press kind of thing. But I was in the press room the whole time, and I actually became what was known as the media liaison, because the media people began to realize that I was the person they could come up to and ask what was going on, both from the chess side and from the computer side. So that was my primary goal my primary job during the first match, was to talk to the media as the game was being played, answer their questions, things like that. All right, so as you probably know, that first year, Kasparov won the match in Philadelphia, and there was a rematch set for the next year, which was even bigger, and this time IBM was the host, so they moved it up to Manhattan, and the ICCA was no longer running the match, and I was originally not asked to even be part of it, but I asked them, based on my experience with the first match, if I could help out, and IBM said okay, and my job in the second match was to go to their VIP room where the IBM special customers were, and to talk to the VIP people during the match and explain to them what was going on. I was there with several other grandmasters to do that job, and occasionally I would stop in the main hall where Sirwan and Ashley were talking to the big group. Okay, so that sets up a little bit what's happening. So after the first game, we have the second game, Deep Blue is white. Let's take a look at the game, and then we'll talk a little bit about what happened during and after the game. All right, so Deep Blue is white, second game of the second match. E4, Kasparov plays E5, knight F3, knight C6, bishop B5, Roy Lopez. A6, bishop A4, knight F6, castle, bishop E7, this is the closed variation. Rook E1, B5, bishop B3, D6. Today, more grandmasters castle first. threatening to play the martial attack and keeping white guessing a little bit. Kasparov goes right for the main line of the closed defense. c3, castle, h3. So this is the tabi opposition, and here black has many possibilities. If you want to see what about the moves that we got up to here in more detail, the second video I ever did in my YouTube series was about this opening. You can go back and look up how to learn chess openings with an example of the closed Roy Lopez. All right, so Kasparov plays the Smyslov variation h6. That's not the most popular, but it's fairly popular. And Kasparov, of course, is trying to just get into an interesting playable middle game. All right, Deep Blue plays the main move d4, rook e8, similar to the Zaitsev variation where black's going to play bishop f8 and threaten to take the pawn and pressure the e-pawn. White plays knight bd2, bishop f8, knight f1, all standard stuff. Okay, so now if black plays pawn takes pawn, then this knight is going to be hanging. So for instance, let's say a stockfish here. Let's move this up a little bit. Make it a little bit smaller. Okay, so now if black tries to win the pawn, pawn takes, let's say he plays knight takes, bishop d5 hits both knights. If he takes with the rook first, then simply rook takes, knight takes, bishop d5 again. So that pawn is poisoned. Kasparov can't take it. He could trade off the pawns if he wants, but he can't take the e-pawn. All right, let's move the video back down. Center the board. Okay, bring it back down a little bit. So what's interesting here is I'm using Stockfish 12, which is, so much, but Deep Blue at the time was just catching up to Kasparov, let's say around 2800, and Stockfish 12 plays like over 3500. Now, maybe not on my computer, which isn't as fast as the ones it normally runs on, but mine's pretty fast, so it doesn't lose that much at the speed that my computer is with a couple of CPUs running. All right, so bishop to d7. That's a little bit unusual for Kasparov. Don't know if he's trying to take Deep Blue out of the book or not. Knight to g3. Typical play over. Now protecting the e-pawn, keeping an eye on knight to f5. Kasparov says, would you like to give me the bishop pair? Deep Blue says, of course not. I'll bring the bishop back. These bishops here are called the Lopez bishops. c5 hitting at the center. b3 keeping the knight out of c4. Knight c6. And Deep Blue closes the center. So now all the play is going to be on the wings. Knight to e7. So black's break move on the king side is f5. White can break with f4. Both sides might have some pawn moves on the queen side. Bishop e3, just developing. Kasparov is probably pretty happy to play a kind of a closed position because computers are so good at calculating lines in open positions that by maneuvering and doing long strategy, it gives humans a good chance. Now today, when the computers are so much better than they were in 1997 when this game was played, it really doesn't make much of a difference anymore. Or as Nigel Short says, I keep playing the computer with hope that someday I'll get a draw that never comes. Okay, so knight to g6, queen to d2, knight to h7 with the idea of trading pieces off on the g5 square. Also with the idea of possibly breaking with f5 in some lines. Can't do it right away. a4 playing on the queen side. Knight to h4, trading off a little bit. When you're cramped, trade off helps a little bit. Knight takes h4, queen takes h4, queen to e2, keeping an eye on that b5 square. Kasparov just brings his queen back to d8. b4. This is the kind of move that you see grandmasters play a lot on the queen side to try to force black's hand. Kasparov tries to keep it flexible with queen to c7. Deep Blue develops the rook to the same line where the queen is. Very often a good strategy. That way, if black doesn't play c4, then when the pawns start being traded, there gets tactical chances later for white. Kasparov sees that as a chance to lock the C file. And now white can open the A file and play on the A file, or white can try to play on the king side. Stockfish 12 says right now that if white plays perfectly after black did that, white should be close to winning. Let's see if he thought C4 was a mistake. No, he says white's close to winning strategically anyway. But there's a long way to go here, and there's a lot of play left in the game. So even though Kasparov, I'm sure he's an excellent evaluator, and he probably felt a little uncomfortable. If Stockfish 12 says he's down by 1.5 points, we know that Kasparov felt that he was in a less good position here. But still, again, lots of play left in the game. Rook to A3, getting ready to double rooks before you take the pawn, making black try to guard this square so that he can take back with the pawn. Rook F8, rook doubles, and now the queen goes back to D8 so that the rook on A8 is now guarded twice, so that on pawn takes pawn, he's able to take back with the pawn. Doesn't want to take with the bishop and isolate all his pawns here. The C pawn won't be isolated, it would be artificially isolated if he took with the bishop. All right, so F4, the break move on the king side now. Now black would love to take that and put pressure on the E file, but he's too busy guarding the A file to be able to move his heavy pieces onto the E file. So he just brings his knight back toward the center. Deep Blue takes the pawn, and now when Kasparov takes back, Deep Blue will have a protected passed pawn on D5. Queen to F1, keeps an eye on the F5 square, and also guards the rook on A1 in certain lines. Knight back to E8, going to blockade in front of the protected passed pawn. Whenever you see these protected passed pawns, a lot of times if you can get a knight in front of it, it'll neutralize it because it not only blocks the pawn, but it also attacks the pawn that's guarding the pawn. So Deep Blue plays Queen F2 with an idea in some lines playing Bishop to B6. Knight D6 as planned. Bishop B6 ditto. Queen goes to E8. And Deep Blue just waits and plays Rook on 3 to A2. He's in no hurry to open up the A file yet. White has nice play on both sides of the board. Again, Stockfish 12 says White's up by about a pawn and a half. Okay, Bishop E7, Bishop C5, Bishop back F8. Kasparov doesn't have too much to do. He just has to wait. White plays Knight F5. Now that knight is a monster. Black has to decide, if and how he's going to take it. He takes with the bishop. Now white has the bishop pair. Pawn takes. Now this D pawn is artificially isolated. What do I mean by artificially isolated? He's not isolated because he has a pawn on an adjacent file, but that pawn on the adjacent file, for all intents and purposes, can never guard the pawn on D5. So that's what I mean by artificially isolated. All right, but it also is a very strong passed pawn. All right, black plays F6. Now he's weak on the white squares on the king side, but in some lines white was threatening to play F6 himself and maybe eventually get the queen on that diagonal, and the H7 square would be vulnerable. So Deep Blue gives up the bishop pair with the idea that he sees ahead that once he trades, he can penetrate with his queen into B6 and attack the bishop at D6 and the pawn at B5. So Kasparov takes back with the bishop. Deep Blue takes the pawn, takes back, and now white can win a pawn with queen to B6. So here, Deep Blue was programmed to play, in the first match, play every 90 seconds or so. But if he failed high or he failed low, he would take more time. I don't remember his time management on this move, but I think he might have failed high and seeing that he was getting something. Now, Deep Blue doesn't look as far ahead as Stockfish 12 does. Stockfish 12 here says that in his furthest line, he's looking ahead in this position, 40 ply. And let me show you the move that Stockfish 12 wants to play, so you know I'm not lying here. It's bishop to E4. He's not going to win the pawn right away. He's going to just solidify the center and practically put black into Zugzwang. So bishop E4 is the best move. Now, to give you a little background, Garry Kasparov was training with the Fritz team. The Fritz, it was one of the best PC computers. It still is. It's not quite as dominant in the field in 2020 as it was in 1997. But in 1998, I got the version of Fritz, and on my computer in 1998 wasn't nearly as fast as the one I'm using here to make this video. And I gave Fritz, which was the software that Garry Kasparov was using to prepare for the match, and I said to Fritz, what do you think is the best move here? Now, I'm asking a 1998 computer, which is much slower than Deep Blue. Like my computer today, probably in 2020 is even faster than Deep Blue was, even though Deep Blue was a hardware computer in 1998. I've got another 20 years of technology there. But I was using a 1998 computer, which was not nearly as fast as the 1997 Deep Blue. And I was using Garry Kasparov's own software. I don't mean he owns it, but he used it, Fritz, and Fritz agreed with Stockfish, even back in 1998, that bishop e4 was the best move. Well, if Fritz could find the move in 1998, you better believe that Deep Blue could find it in 1997. Okay, that's not proof of anything, of course, and we'll talk about that in a second, but Deep Blue played bishop e4. Now, we're going to get to what happened at the end of the match in a minute or two, but Garry Kasparov claimed after the game that he knows how computers think in terms of how much time they take and what kind of moves they play, and he knows that the white could have won a pawn if he didn't do that. And he claimed that move could not have been made by a computer like Deep Blue in 1997. He said only a sophisticated grandmaster with a good positional sense would understand why bishop e4 was a better move than not winning the pawn. And he says Deep Blue could not have found that move, and he took more time than normal, and everything is very suspicious, and Deep Blue was cheating to make that move. Okay, so fast forwarding to the end of the game a little bit, when Kasparov made this claim, there was a person who was working at the match whose name was Ken Thompson. If you Googled Ken Thompson invented the Unix operating system, one of the most important operating systems for software developers ever invented. He invented the Unix operating system when he worked for Bell Labs, and he also was involved with computer chess. He wrote a program called Bell, which, if I remember correctly, was the first program in the world to get, I think it was the first one to get a master title, a 2200 rating. I might be misremembering. It might have been the first one to get an expert title, but it was the first one to break one of those two barriers, either expert or master, back around in the early 80s. So, of course, this is, I'm trying to think, is it early 80s? No, around late 80s, around 1990. So this is 1997. So even though Ken Thompson worked for Bell Labs and not IBM, IBM had invited him as a very, very special guest. And what they asked him to do with his expertise in computer chess was during the matches, he would sit in a booth in the back and he would monitor Deep Blue's analysis as it was playing the game. Because Deep Blue, about every second, would put out what it thought was the PV. Just like here, you can see I have the PV for down here that's being put out. So this is exactly the kind of thing that Ken Thompson was watching during the match. So when Kasparov came out and said that Deep Blue was cheating, the one person who was relatively independent who would know, I mean, obviously if you asked the Deep Blue people, they would know that Deep Blue wasn't cheating, but people wouldn't believe him because they would feel like they were prejudiced. But as soon as Ken Thompson heard this, he came running out to the VIP area where I was, and a quick crowd gathered around him, and Ken Thompson announced to me and the others who were standing there at the time, he says, I was watching the monitor when Deep Blue was thinking about playing bishop e4. And indeed, Deep Blue showed the analysis on the monitor that its number one move before it played bishop e4 was bishop e4. And he said not only that, but Deep Blue never changed its mind just before it made a move on any move of the match so far, and that so far he had seen on the monitor every move that Deep Blue had played before Deep Blue played it. Now, it was possible that if Deep Blue was thinking for like 90 seconds, that for 89.9 seconds it might have one best first move, and then in the last tenth of a second switch its mind and play a different move. But Ken Thompson said that never happened. Every move up to that point in the match that Deep Blue had played, Ken Thompson had seen it on the monitor. Well, as I said, Ken Thompson is one of the most respected software engineers in the world. And he came out and he said that he saw that Deep Blue wasn't cheating. Now, we have all this evidence now. Ken Thompson saw Deep Blue analyze bishop e4 on the monitor before it played it. We see that Fritz itself, in 1998 on my computer, was able to find bishop e4 as the best move. So we can see that playing bishop e4 is not only beyond the capability, not beyond the capability of Deep Blue finding it, but actually it's the most likely move that Deep Blue would have found based on all our evidence, much less the fact that Ken Thompson said that he absolutely did play it. You know, he did find it himself. No grandmaster came in and interfered. He saw the analysis going through, just like you see the analysis that I showed you a few seconds ago on the screen. Okay, so anyway, the game continued. Rook takes, queen takes, grabbing the A file. White's completely winning. Let me show you what Stockfish is saying here, which is very interesting. So Stockfish says White's up 3.5. Kasparov tries queen d7. Queen a7, as good as any. Rook c7. And now the best move, according to Stockfish, is queen b8 check with +4. Stockfish plays queen b6, which is almost as good, about the same a value. Rook to b7. And now Stockfish says rook a8 is +4.9. Deep Blue plays rook a8, king f7, best move. And now it says queen a6 is +5. Deep Blue plays queen a6, +5. Kasparov plays queen c7. And now Stockfish says Deep Blue should play king h2 at +5.6. Deep Blue plays queen c6, which again is almost as good. Kasparov plays queen b6 check. And now White should play king h2 +6. He plays king f1, which only drops to +5. And Kasparov plays rook b8, and now the best move is queen takes b6 +5. Deep Blue plays rook a6. You can see that all of a sudden Stockfish drops tremendously to about +1 from +5. So rook a6 is a pretty big mistake. And what Kasparov should do is just play queen to e3. And here, Kasparov saw queen to e3, but he thought he was losing a piece because he thought after queen takes d6, queen takes e4, queen takes b8, he's losing a rook. The problem is that on queen to e3, if queen takes d6, Black doesn't have to take the bishop, of course. He thought if he had time to save the rook, that Stockfish would that Deep Blue would therefore save the bishop. But Deep Blue can't save the bishop here. If he plays bishop f3, then Kasparov gets a perpetual check. Queen c1 check, king e2, queen b2 check, king d1, queen b3 check, king c1, queen takes c3 check, king d1. And if we do different moves, you're going to see a different draw. For instance, queen c1 check, king f2, queen d2 check. If bishop e2, queen f4 check. If he tries king g1, queen c1 check. If he tries bishop f1, queen e3 check. If king h1, then simply queen c1. And White can't guard the bishop. He'd have to move the king back to guard it. And he doesn't have any mates with rook a7. So this is a draw. But this is a draw that Kasparov didn't see. And he figured that the computer had seen this and that it didn't work and that this was just winning, when in fact rook a6 is actually a mistake. So in this position, Kasparov resigned. Okay, so what happened? So queen e3, as you can see, doesn't really draw. After queen e3, queen takes d6, rook e8, white should not play bishop f3 and allow the draw. White should play queen c7 check, rook e7, queen c6, and allow queen takes e4. When after d6, queen d3 check, king g1. If black saves the rook, rook e8, he doesn't have a perpetual here. White can then stop the perpetual with rook a1, and we see Stockfish says that white's up by about plus 1.3 or so. Okay, so with our modern technology in 2020, we see white still has some winning chances if he doesn't try to save the piece. But we didn't know that in 1998. We thought, oh, on queen e3, it's probably going to be a draw. All right, so I went home from Manhattan, came back here to the Philadelphia area, and I went on the internet, which was, not as big a deal in 1997, but still a pretty big deal. And people on the internet, on the chess sites, were talking about the fact that they had used their engines and that after queen e3, let's go back a move, that after queen e3 here, that if Deep Blue takes the bishop and Kasparov plays rook e8 and Deep Blue tries to save the bishop, that it's a draw. So I analyzed with my engines that day, and I came to the conclusion that they were correct, that was going to be a draw. So I went back up to New York for the third game, and I got there early since I was working there, and I went to the main hall where Yasser Seirawan was preparing to talk to the couple thousand people who were going to come in half an hour. So I said to Yasser, Yasser, did you hear the news? And Yasser said to me, no, Dan, what are you talking about? And I said, it looks like Kasparov resigned in a drawn position. And Seirawan said, really? And I said, yes. He says, can you show me? So I put up the board and I showed queen e3. And we looked at queen takes d6, rook e8. And we looked at what happens if white tries to save the bishop, the fact that it's a draw. Now, of course, as we now know, white shouldn't, after queen takes rook e8, white shouldn't try to save the bishop. He should play queen d7 and let the rook attack the queen. But we didn't know that in 1997. So I showed him the analysis that the game should have been a draw. And Seirawan was, like, wow, I didn't know that. That's big news. So I went back to the audience, and a while later they started the show, and Seirawan comes up and he welcomes everybody in. There's like 2,000 people sitting in the audience, and I'm sitting like in the second row. And Seirawan says, there's big news. He says, I don't know if you heard, but at the end of the last game, Kasparov resigned, but maybe he had a chance for a draw. Let me show it to you. And he gets out the board, and with the help of the computer and the giant monitor, he shows everybody this. But what he doesn't do is he never mentioned my name. I don't know if Yasser was just so excited or he didn't want to. I don't know what happened. You'd have to ask Yasser. I never did. But he went through all this big news, and I was the one who told him about it like 20 minutes earlier, and he never mentioned that, with the help of Master Dan Heisman, who gave me the information, he had seen it on the internet. He never mentioned my name. So he went through this big thing about this big surprise. And then what happened was people, of course, had to tell Garry Kasparov about it. And the story was that they were going out to dinner the next day, and one of the grandmasters who was working with Kasparov said that it was his job to tell Garry. So he said, Garry, I got something to tell you. And he said, when you resigned, you still had some chances if you played queen e3, because he can't save the piece as a perpetual check. And Gary's like, really? And the grandmaster said, yeah. And he started to explain the lines, and he said Garry stared up into the sky, sort of like Beth Harmon in looking up at the ceiling in The Queen's Gambit, stared up at the sky to do the analysis in his head, and then he just sort of started shaking his head like, oh my goodness, how could this be, And of course, the fact that he had already said that Deep Blue was cheating, and now on top of that, it came out that he may have missed a possible drawing line here. And if you can see right now at 44 ply, Stockfish 12 has it at 0.75, so it's certainly no forced win. But, you know, and of course, telling Garry that didn't help his mood, and eventually that famous sixth game happened, and Kasparov lost with that famous trap in the Caro can that Patrick Wolf and I thought that Garry allowed on purpose for reasons that are beyond the scope of this video, but I could probably write a book about being at the Kasparov-Deep Blue matches. All right, so, I mean, now we know, you know, it was inevitable that the computers were going to beat the humans. Today, we don't see any matches where Magnus Carlsen is playing, you know, Stockfish 12 or Alpha Zero or anything. You know, Magnus is in the 2800s, and the computers are in the 3500s, so it'd be more like, can Magnus do well if they gave him pawn odds or something? But, of course, in 1997, this was big, big, big news, and I was very honored and very happy to have worked at both matches, and it gives me a great set of memories that I can pass along to you guys. And I hope you enjoyed the video. There's a lot more that happened at the matches that we can talk about sometime, but I wanted to go over, did Deep Blue cheat in the game against Kasparov? And the answer is no, absolutely not. Deep Blue did not cheat. We have all kinds of evidence that he didn't. And at the final ceremony where Kasparov came out and said that Deep Blue was cheating, IBM had told all the Deep Blue programmers, do not get into back and forth with Garry Kasparov. So when Garry was making those announcements, I was watching their faces, and they were all like biting their lip and shuffling their feet like, you know, let me, because this was their life work. And they had created a computer that was the first one to be able to beat the world champion. And instead of getting the accolades, they were being accused of cheating. And, you know, when you put your life's work into something and you do such a great job, and then the bottom line is you get accused of cheating like that, it really hurts. But they were told not to fight back. And then later on, Dr. Su, who was the head of the Deep Blue team, wrote a book. And, of course, you can buy the book. I think it's called... is it called Inside Deep Blue, Behind Deep Blue? Something like that. But if you look on, you know, Dr. Su, H-S-I-E-U, is that how he spells his name? I think. It's not H-S-U, I don't think. Anyway, Behind Deep Blue. So, yeah, I have that book. It's a good book. And, of course, you know, he's not going to tell you anything in there that varies a lot from what I just said. All right, a little long for today's video, but it was worth it. It's a great story, and if you liked it, give me the like and tell your friends and subscribe to the channel. Thanks a lot. Bye.